Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. As some of you may know, U.S.-Russian relations is in the news these days, so I thought, isn't this a good time to review U.S.-Russian relations since the end of World War II? Right? Isn't that an excellent way to spend some time? So let's do that. This will not be a review of the entire Cold War, but really just focusing on Russian-U.S. relations since the end of World War II in a relaxing and casual way, right? Why get upset about international relations which may result in the end of life on Earth? We can do that very casually indeed. So let's start. 1945, the end of World War II. That happened on the 8th of May, 1945 in Europe, and on August 14th in Japan, and that was prompted by the intervention of Russia, or the Soviet Union, declaring war on Japan on August 8th, exactly 3 months after the end of World War II in Europe, which was the last day of the designated time frame that was agreed to at Yalta between the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom. It was agreed that the USSR would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of the end of the war in Europe, and they did so on the very last day. Indisputable research shows that the surrender of Japan was not compelled by the dropping of the two atomic bombs, but by the intervention of the Soviet Union in the war. That is not to say that the dropping of the atomic bombs was a good thing or a bad thing. That, I think, is a moral question. What is an historical issue, though, is that the leaders of Japan at the time were not persuaded to end the war by the use of the atomic bombs. In any event, in August 1945, World War II ended. The U.S. was an ally of the Soviet Union and had been since Pearl Harbor. And the question was whether that alliance would be maintained after the war. But as we will see, of course, it did not. The following year, this happened. In July 1946, the U.S., the USSR, and the United Kingdom met at Potsdam in Germany, the first meeting after the end of the war, and during that meeting it was decided that Germany would be divided into four sectors: the USSR, the United States, France, and Great Britain. And Berlin, which would be located in the eastern section, in the Soviet sector, would also be divided into four sectors. Later, the US, UK, and France would merge their sectors so that Germany and Berlin would be divided into two. One would be the western section, Western Germany, and then East Germany, which would be communist. And then Berlin as a city would be divided itself. So the former allies would now be facing one another in Germany literally facing one another in Germany as a country and in the city of Berlin itself. And so the division between capitalist democratic West and the communist East would be most clearly evident and manifest in Germany, which would be a sticking point for the remaining, or for the next 50 years. And the next trigger point would be the following year. Poland. Of course, I apologize for my handwriting as usual. At Yalta in February 1945, which was an Allied conference prior to the end of the Second World War, Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, agreed that Poland would be allowed to have free elections after the war. However, he reneged on that commitment, and Poland had a puppet government installed in it by the Soviet Union, a communist puppet government. Poland was not furnished free elections, so Stalin violated that commitment given at Yalta. At the time, the United States and its allies felt unable and certainly were unwilling to do anything about that because the Red Army occupied Poland. But nevertheless, that was Stalin's one of his initial violations of a post-war agreement. The same year, was the promulgation of the Truman Doctrine, and the Truman Doctrine was that the United States would support free people resisting communism anywhere in the world, and that was prompted by the struggle in Greece and in Turkey against, or I should say the struggle between communist forces and, well, they'd be called democratic forces, but they really weren't. But let's say non-communist forces were struggling for power in Greece and in Turkey. And the U.S. developed a policy which was to support really any government that was non-communist. And so the United States furnished financial aid to Greece and to Turkey to help defeat communism in those countries. And so Stalin's aggression in Poland, political aggression, I suppose we could say, and his endeavors to install further communist regimes in Greece and Turkey were met with U.S. efforts to deny Stalin those victories, and that would become a theme of the Cold War, the expansion of the Soviet Union versus the attempt to contain the Soviet Union by the United States. And that was as clear. Indeed, in 1947 was one more thing I should write, which was, we'll call it, this was the long telegram, and that was literally a very long telegram sent by George Kennan, who was in the State Department and an expert on the Soviet Union. And in that telegram, he presented the notion that the best way to counteract expansionist tendencies of the Soviet Union was to contain communism, but that it should be policymakers in the U.S. and elsewhere should be aware that the USSR or the Russians had an historical aversion and wariness of being surrounded because of multiple invasions, that is, by the Germans in World War II, the Germans in World War I, the French in the 19th century, and indeed the Mongols in the 13th century. So the Russians had an historic, well-founded fear of invasion. That is what they were trying to prevent, presumably by trying to expand, but also they had ideological reasons, that is communism and its expansionist tendencies. And so the long telegram enunciated the policy of containment that the U.S. would follow again for the next 45 years. Then we have this. The Soviet Union was annoyed that Berlin, which was located in communist East Germany, had U.S. forces inside of it. That is, the Soviet Union wanted the U.S. out of West Berlin and wanted to control Berlin for itself. And so in 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded the pathways, that is, the agreed corridors through East Germany, through which the United States would traverse to enter West Berlin. So they essentially blockaded American access to West Berlin, and in response, the United States conducted a year-long airlift to West Berlin, by which hundreds and thousands, really, and ultimately millions of tons of supplies were airlifted into Berlin, and that city was sustained by that effort over a year. So basically what happened is the Soviet Union denied ground access to U.S. forces, and so the U.S. said, well, fair enough, we're going to fly there, and we'll see whether the Soviet Union feels strongly enough to shoot down American planes. They did not, because that clearly would have been an act of war, which the Soviet Union was not prepared to do, because at that time the Soviet Union did not have an atomic bomb, and the U.S. did, and had just used it 3 years earlier. But again, the blockade of Berlin was a clear act of Soviet aggression, or recalcitrance at least, and an attempt to exercise complete domination over every free area in their purview. A free, prosperous West Berlin stuck in the craw of Stalin, and made the communist efforts look pretty poor in comparison, because as it later became obvious, Stalinist communism did not really lead to economic and social prosperity, and that was evident even in 1948. Okay, and then the following year, in response, well, there's three things. So we have NATO, (1949) was a pretty big year in the Cold War. Three major significant events happened. One was the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The United States and its World War II allies, mainly in Europe, banded together in a military alliance to contain and to combat and to mutually support one another against Soviet aggression. Obviously, there is a school, it may not be so obvious, but there is a school of history that argues that the Soviet Union was a victim of the United States and its allies, and that the Cold War was caused by the United States. I am not an apologist for the United States. I am well aware of its destructive tendencies in many cases, but and as will be seen. But in this case, it is very clear that the Soviet Union was ideologically motivated and acting to expand its sphere of influence, that it violated its agreements in Yalta, and that Stalin's primary interest was to aggrandize as much power and authority as possible at the expense of the people of Eastern Europe. And if he had a chance to roll his tanks into Paris, I think he would have done so. Therefore, NATO made a lot of sense. I think it was defensible, and that was organized in 1949. That very same year, the USSR detonated its first atomic bomb, much to the surprise of the US, who did not expect it to occur so soon. But of course, the Soviet Union had spies throughout the US nuclear science community that fed information to Soviet scientists, so that their bomb was developed clearly within only 4 years of the first detonations of the atomic bomb. And then that same year, in October, to be precise, the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong, defeated the Chinese nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and established Communist China, or as it was known then, Red China, as it was known in the West anyway. And so 1949 was a pretty big year in the Cold War, because it meant that the United States lost its nuclear monopoly, that 1/4 of the world was under communist control, and not just 1/4 of the world, but a sizable portion of the Earth's landmass. And so at that point, clearly the Cold War was well underway. And then the very following year, the Cold War turned hot. Again, I'm intending to focus on U.S.-Russian relations, but these things are all related. So on June 25th, 1950, the North Koreans invaded the South. Stalin had given permission to Kim Il-sung, who was the leader of the North Koreans, to do that. The North Koreans were communist, or at least the government of North Korea was communist. Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel after the end of World War II. And so the North invaded the South. And the United Nations, which was new at the time, only a few years old, agreed to send forces to stop the North Koreans. The Soviet Union had boycotted the Security Council at that time in protest for not recognizing the communist takeover of China. So the Soviets were not there to boycott the decision to send troops by the United Nations. Although many countries sent troops to Korea, it was primarily a U.S. force led by General Douglas MacArthur. I will not go too much into the Korean War at all, except to say that it ended in 1953, which is the next date of significance. In 1953, two things of importance happened. One is the Korean War ended. It ended by the United States really threatening the use of atomic weapons, and the Soviets pressuring the North Koreans to give up, and the Chinese. Again, it's difficult not to go into too much detail because it will lead us. It will lead to a 45-year video. But point is that the Korean War ended in 1953 in what really was a stalemate. In fact, it still continues technically. Only an armistice has been signed, not a peace treaty. But in any event, Korea, as I'm sure you know, remains divided at the 38th parallel, with the South being a democratic republic and the North communist. But also in 1953, the United States, specifically the CIA, acted to overthrow the democratically elected leader of Iran, Mossadegh, and instead, or I should say as a result of that coup, the Shah of Iran was installed. And this was because the CIA, or that is the United States, did not like Mossadegh. They felt that he was communist or a communist sympathizer. He wasn't. He was not. He's completely indefensible. And so they installed the Shah, who was not totalitarian, but he was corrupt. He was authoritarian, certainly. But who cared, right? As long as he was anti-communist, the U.S. was A-OK with that. That turned out to be a pretty big mistake on the part of the United States, but at the time it fit into Cold War thinking, which was anybody was better than a communist, or at least a communist who sympathized with the Soviet Union. Similarly, the CIA felt that it was on a roll, and so the following year, in 1954, the United States, specifically the CIA, overthrew the popular president of Guatemala, whose name was Arbenz, and installed a CIA puppet in Guatemala because, guess why? Because there were concerns that Arbenz was sympathetic to communism. He was not. But the CIA, meaning the United States, would exercise its influence wherever it felt the need to combat or contain communism. Again, this goes back to the long telegram where communism should be contained. And communism was considered a monolithic bloc without diversity and all run by Stalin. That was a false and incorrect analysis, but that's what it was. And so the United States had no qualms or trepidations about overthrowing democratically elected governments wherever it suited the aims of containment. Again, not defensible, but that is what happened. Next year, two things in 1955. The first one is that the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact, which was an analog to NATO. So it was an alliance of Soviet satellites and the Soviet Union, a military pact, providing that it would respond militarily to any aggression by the West. And also in 1955, the first summit meeting or conference between the Soviet Union and the United States occurred. between Nikita Khrushchev, who was the new leader of the Soviet Union, and U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower. It was an attempt to thaw the Cold War, the groundwork for which had been done by Khrushchev, who denounced Stalin and the cult of personality which Stalin cultivated in a so-called secret meeting at the first communist plenary session in the Soviet Union. Quote-unquote secret, because the details were leaked and the details were understood that they would be leaked. In any event, Khrushchev said that Stalin committed many crimes. He abused his people, responsible for the millions of deaths. And so in acknowledging those atrocities, Khrushchev attempted to reframe the relationship between the Soviet government and the Soviet Union, the people of the Soviet Union, and other communist satellite states. And that was essentially an olive branch to the West to try to reshape the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, leading to this summit, which seemed great, right? The Korean War was over, and at least people are talking. However, that would be short-lived, because the following year, well, you see what happened. Oh crap, I dropped my pen. What happened is that people in Hungary, which had a communist government, a puppet government installed by the Soviet Union, the people of Hungary thought, oh, maybe Khrushchev means what he says. Maybe Khrushchev is not Stalin. Maybe we can be free and act for ourselves. And so the people of Hungary thought, why not try to have a popularly elected government? Why not try to exhibit some freedom? Well, they tried to do that by taking to the streets, and the next thing you know, Soviet tanks were rumbling through the streets of Budapest. And so what happened is that the Soviet Union crushed an effort to restore democracy, or to at least try to get some democracy to Hungary, and that put another freeze in the Cold War in U.S.-Soviet relations. And the previous 2 years, any accomplishments of those 2 years were sort of discarded, because once again it was very evident that the Soviet Union would simply not tolerate or brook any deviation from the communist line. You must not be free from Soviet influence, was the clear message. And yet, oops, it's always got to be one mistake here in my writing. Well, in the next year, 1957, October 4th to be specific, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite. That was Sputnik, about the size of a beach ball. And this was a great shock to the West, and particularly to the United States, because it meant two important things. The first one was that the Soviet Union seemed to be much more technologically advanced than the United States thought it was, and also that it meant that if the Soviet Union had rockets powerful enough to blast a satellite into space, it also had rockets powerful enough to deliver a nuclear weapon to the United States. That was the real significance, not so much the achievement, the scientific achievement in terms of the satellite, but what it meant about the rocket booster itself. So that scared the crap out of the United States and its allies, and which would eventually spawn the space race some years later. Another shock to the West occurred later. In 1959, the country of Cuba, there was a revolution led by Fidel Castro, who only died a couple weeks ago at the age of 90. Cuba was ruled by a corrupt, really a dickweed, named Batista, who was an American puppet. But he was anti-communist, right? So he was okay. But in any event, the Cuban people were aggrieved and impoverished and poorly governed, and so Fidel Castro decided he would change all of that. And after initial entreaties to the United States, which were rebuffed, Castro declared himself a communist and aligned Cuba with the Soviet Union. That was absolutely an avoidable event, but the United States bungled its early relations with Castro. And so what you had then was a communist country, not a satellite, but an ally anyway, to the Soviet Union, only 90 miles from the shores of the United States. So that was not too exciting for the United States at the time. And of course, that's significant because of what it led to next, which is this. So John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, and when he was transitioning into that office, he was informed by the outgoing president, Dwight Eisenhower, that a program was underway to foment an invasion of Cuba by Cuban dissidents, exiled Cubans who had fled Castro's revolution, that the CIA was training these people to invade Cuba and to defeat Castro, that is, to reverse the gains of the Cuban Revolution. And Kennedy was skeptical, but he said to himself, hey, Eisenhower knows what he's doing. The CIA must know what they're doing. Okay, you can proceed with the operation. But it turns out the CIA did not know what it was doing, that this secret plan was not at all very secret, that the training that was occurring in Central America was well publicized throughout the Caribbean, that Castro knew exactly what was going on, where the rebels were going to land, when they were going to land. And so when they arrived at the beaches, Castro was ready for them and soundly defeated them, and the U.S. military pressured Kennedy for air support for the rebels and to declare, not to declare war, but certainly to assist the rebels with air support and with other military help. But Kennedy said, I don't think so, because he did not want to start World War III. And the Bay of Pigs turned out to be a massive fiasco, for which Kennedy blamed the CIA and the military, and decided that the CIA and the military are idiots, or at least are smug, overconfident, and not as smart as they appear to be. And that was not an auspicious way for Kennedy to begin his administration, because this occurred only in less than 3 months after he was sworn in as president. Only a few months after this, in August of 1961, the Berlin Wall was erected, and what was happening was that the people of communist East Berlin were flooding into free West Berlin, where opportunities were better, where job opportunities were better, where the standard of living was better, and where they can get the hell out of East Germany and go to free West Germany. Point is, there was a serious brain drain and talent drain going on in East Berlin, and the Soviet Union decided that they would put a stop to that, and so a wall was erected dividing East and West Berlin, And the point was that the people in East Berlin were trapped there. They simply were denied freedom to go to the West. And so communism was such a great system that you had to essentially cage people in, otherwise they would leave. Again, Soviet communism was not Marxist communism, and so we should make a distinction there. But certainly what was occurring in East Germany at that time was not... Clearly many people didn't want any part of that, and they had to wall them in, otherwise they'd all leave. And then probably the most dangerous period for humanity ever, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. After the Bay of Pigs incident, Castro was worried about the U.S. overthrowing him. The Soviet Union was worried about that too, because they valued having a Soviet ally so close to the United States. And so Khrushchev, under pressure from the Politburo, that is the communist government in the Soviet Union, decided to send nuclear weapons and missile launchers to Cuba, effectively making Cuba a missile base for Soviet nuclear weapons. That was discovered by American reconnaissance flights, specifically by the U-2 aircraft, and John F. Kennedy decided to respond to this by blockading Cuba, which was called a quarantine, because a blockade, strictly speaking, is an act of war. A quarantine is not, but it was a blockade, which meant that no ships from the Soviet Union could pass through the borders, the aquatic borders of Cuba, essentially isolating Cuba and preventing it from getting more missiles. The result was that really, if you go through this in detail, what you will find is that the whole world was extremely close to a nuclear conflict, because one misunderstanding, one miscommunication could have resulted in the launching of a missile. And indeed, the U.S. military at the time was all for a full-on military attack of Cuba, which absolutely would have started a Third World War. In the event, what did occur is that the United States secretly agreed to withdraw missiles from Turkey, which the Soviet Union did not appreciate them being there because of their proximity to the Soviet Union. So the U.S. agreed to secretly withdraw Jupiter missiles from Turkey and to promise never to invade Cuba. In return, the Soviet Union would withdraw the missiles from Cuba, and that is exactly what happened. So cooler heads prevailed, but really it is President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev who deserve the credit, because people under them were really were indeed more than ready and more than willing to engage in a war over Cuba. That would have been disastrous, to say the least. One positive sign at this period was in 1963, the U.S., the Soviet Union, and several other countries signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which banned atmospheric tests of nuclear weapons. As I recall, something like 300 or more, I think between 300 and 400 atmospheric tests had been conducted of nuclear weapons since 1945. Not just atmospheric, but also in the oceans. France has not signed that treaty, I don't think, and they detonated nuclear weapons in the Pacific Ocean within the last 15 years, as I recall, which I don't think we can appreciate. But in any event, that was a highlight of Russian-U.S. relations. That hey, let's not simply blow off nuclear bombs on the ground and risk fallout, polluting the atmosphere. Maybe that's a good idea, and it is. In 1965, the U.S. sent ground forces into Vietnam in Southeast Asia. This was again part of the policy of containment. The communist North Vietnam was attempting to unite the country under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, who was an identified communist, even though he used the U.S. Declaration of Independence as a model for his own declaration of what he wanted for Vietnam. The truth is that the conflict, or what was happening in Vietnam, was a civil war. It was not a Soviet or Chinese directed effort to expand communism. That's what the U.S. thought it was. It was wrong. And the pertinence of the Vietnam War here is that the Soviet Union certainly assisted and supported North Vietnamese efforts to fight the United States, which prolonged the war and which ultimately resulted in the United States losing that conflict, which reduced the prestige of the United States in relation to the Soviet Union. This was a war that lasted for 10 years, and it is the first war that the United States lost. In Korea, it was a draw, so you could say. And of course, the War of 1812, too, the United States did not exactly win it, because the Treaty of Ghent, which ended that conflict in 1814, was status quo antebellum, meaning everything the same before the war. But because Andrew Jackson defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans on January 8th, 1815, that's considered, it was an American victory, but it happened after the treaty was signed. I digress, but the point is that the U.S. did not win, strictly speaking, the War of 1812, nor did it win the war in Korea, but it definitely lost the war in Vietnam. And that was a direct result of not just the Vietnamese, but also Soviet support of the North Vietnamese, which the U.S. would find retribution later, as we will see. In 1968, a relatively liberal leader of Czechoslovakia gave the impression that people could do whatever they want in that country, and the population thought, oh, okay, maybe we can. But once again, as in Hungary only 12 years before, expressions of freedom and democracy by the people of Czechoslovakia resulted in Soviet tanks rolling through the streets of Prague, diminishing any hopes for individual freedom in that country. And so once again, the heavy hand of the Soviet Union was evident. The Soviet Union was intent on ensuring that Eastern Europe remained firmly in its grip, thus giving lie to any notions that the people in Eastern Europe were willingly members of the Soviet sphere of influence. And then we have in 1972, President Richard Nixon of the U.S. decided that he would go to China, which was not recognized by the United States, had been ignored ever since the communist domination of China in October 1949. But he decided to go there, and I guess I got to speed up a little, I suppose, but the point is that the Chinese and the Soviets were in conflict, sometimes actual battles, people shooting at one another in 1969. So there was a rift between the Chinese communists and the Soviet communists. Nixon decided to exploit that rift using what he called a policy of triangulation, by which he meant that he would become friends with China, which would then scare the crap out of the Soviet Union, and that fear would then be leverage that the United States could use to exert on the Soviet Union for concessions, specifically in Vietnam. So to put it another way, Nixon would form a close relationship with China, which would then he would then use to try to get the Russians to reduce support for the North Vietnamese. And indeed, that is exactly what happened. Nixon went to China. The Soviet Unions were extremely worried about that because they did not want the Chinese and the United States ganging up basically on the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union exerted pressure on the North Vietnamese to come to terms with the United States. And indeed, in January 1973, the war in Vietnam ended. It is not really because the Soviet Union reduced its support. That was just a factor, because indeed, the terms by which the war ended in Vietnam could have been obtained in 1968. But the Nixon campaign, and this is true, this is not a secret. I'm not the only one saying this, but the Nixon campaign, specifically through Henry Kissinger, who would become National Security Advisor and later Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger informed the North Vietnamese, don't agree to the terms of Lyndon Johnson. You'll get a better deal. Or excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrongly. Nixon and Kissinger told the South Vietnamese not to agree to any terms from the North Vietnamese, that under a Nixon presidency, the South Vietnamese would be much better off. But in fact, in the event, Nixon agreed to terms that the North had been offering years before. It really is one of the worst examples of crass, just disgusting political maneuvering imaginable, because half the people, I think about half the Americans in the Vietnam War died under the Nixon administration, even though the war in Vietnam only occurred under Nixon for 3 years. And Nixon supposedly had a secret plan to end the war. Well, the secret plan was to bomb the North Vietnamese, women and children. I shouldn't go on. The point is that Nixon's visit to China exerted influence on the Soviet Union, which then led to this, which is SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 1, and that was the first arms agreement, that is, nuclear arms agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so that was good. So that was actually a success. And indeed, the term for that is détente, a French word which sort of means friendship or peace, goodwill. And so a new era supposedly occurred in the early 1970s due to Nixon's so-called strategic thinking. But that was all to end as well. because in 1979 the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in support of a regime there that was pro-Soviet. And as a result, the United States embargoed the Soviet Union, prohibited grain exports, for example, and boycotted the Moscow Olympics in 1980. And the United States decided to support and supply anti-Soviet fighters in Afghanistan in the same way that the Soviets supported the North Vietnamese against the United States in Vietnam. And so that the war in Afghanistan was considered the Soviet Union's Vietnam. It did last for 9 years and was extremely brutal. And the war in Afghanistan, as some of you may know, ultimately was the crucible within which was formed Al-Qaeda and other jihadi groups. So that was a momentous thing. Afghanistan also nixed, oops, that should be capital, but anyway, an agreement was signed, SALT II, but it was never ratified. That is, after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the United States rejected the SALT II treaty in retribution for Soviet behavior. And so for the next 6 years, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were much closer to conflict than had been the case since the early 1960s. And that sort of changed in 1985 with the ascension of Gorbachev, who became the premier of the Soviet Union in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was 54 years old, considerably younger than previous Soviet leaders who had all died. There had been 3 Soviet leaders in the previous 4 years, as I recall. But anyway, Gorbachev instituted perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika was economic restructuring, and glasnost was openness. And Gorbachev attempted to save the Soviet Union by making it, by instituting some liberal reforms, relatively speaking. And he and Reagan, President Reagan of the United States, had a pretty good relationship, which the atmosphere which that created led to, I need more paper, but I'll just have to squeeze this in. Whoops. Well, in 1989, Poland, which had a, let's say, democratic movement called Solidarity under Lech Walesa, elected a non-communist government for the first time. Hungary instituted some liberal reforms in 1989, and East Germany, in November, allowed free travel into Hungary, open borders essentially, and that quickly resulted in open borders into West Berlin. And on November 9th, which is the day that occurred, that is the day that the Berlin Wall symbolically fell. And indeed, people were chopping it down with sledgehammers, so in some sense it literally fell that day too. And so all of that was a culmination of the warmer relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union between 1985 and 1989. But there was a attempted clawback, and I'm sorry I didn't prepare enough paper, so we'll just have to squeeze this one in, but it is the last date anyway. coup. I'll put coup and fall. So in 1991, in August, Soviet hardliners captured, sequestered, imprisoned Mikhail Gorbachev to try to, what should I say, roll back some of Gorbachev's reforms and to try to keep Eastern Europe in line in the Soviet sphere. But Boris Yeltsin, who was the president of Russia, that is to say, of the constituent state of the Soviet Union of Russia, defied the coup leaders and rallied the people of Moscow. That is quite a tale, but in any event, the coup failed, and in December, on December 25th, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and that really is the end of the Cold War and the end of the Cold War acrimony between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The following years maybe are worth another video of U.S. relations with Russia after the Cold War. But what you see is for 46 years, the U.S. and the Soviet Union engaged in a competition for influence, a competition for military supremacy, and for ideological supremacy. And the Soviet Union went away and the United States remained, and so you could say that the U.S. won the Cold War. However, I think that's very simplistic, but the point is that communism in the Soviet Union does no longer exist. But it is very interesting that with the developments in President-elect Trump's administration and the influence of Putin and Russia, it is worth revisiting the Cold War, because it may be true to say that the U.S. won the battle of the Cold War, but perhaps the Russians will end up winning the ultimate competition after all. That remains to be seen. One last thing I will share with you. I have in my hand here, this is a watch. Back in, I should have put it as a date, but I didn't. But back in 1961, another interesting thing that occurred was the first man in space. That was the Russian Yuri Gagarin. And I have here in my hand, this is a watch which was obtained in the Soviet Union in 1989. And here you see a picture of Yuri Gagarin right there. This is kind of a Yuri Gagarin memorial watch, if you will. There's a little tank right there. Clearly a tourist piece, but a pretty nice one, recognizing the first human being in space, which was another first by the Soviet Union in the space race. Yuri Gagarin, unfortunately, was killed in a accident while being a test pilot. But as you know, the Soviet Union had many firsts in space until the U.S. Surpassed it with the Gemini program, specifically with the act of rendezvous, that is, two ships in orbit meeting together. The Soviets never conducted or succeeded in rendezvous. In any event, that's all much different than what this video is supposed to be about. And so, once again, a 20-minute video turned into an hour, but there you have it. I guess it's tough to summarize 46 years of diplomatic history in 20 minutes. I should know that. But I hope you all found this video profitable and learned something you didn't know before. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.